Hey everyone, today we're going to be covering the axial skeleton, so let's get right on into it. So remember, when we're talking about the axial skeleton, we're talking about the bones that are in the midline or median plane of the body. And so we're talking about the skull, the hyoid bone, the rib cage, which includes the sternum and the ribs, as well as the vertebral column, which includes the vertebrae, the sacrum, and the coccyx. And we're going to be covering everything but the skull today. Let's start off with the hyoid bone. It is unique in that it doesn't articulate with any other bone in the body. It supports your tongue, and it's suspended by ligaments coming from the styloid process of the temporal bone. So remember, when we were talking about the skull, there's a super spiky bone that's going to stick out on the inferior surface of the temporal bone, and ligaments are going to be held there to suspend the hyoid bone, which is located anterior to your cervical spine number 3 and your cervical spine number 4, and also inferior to the mandible. So now let's switch gears to the vertebral column. The vertebral column houses the spinal cord, which ends at lumbar vertebrae number 1. It supports the head, and it's the point of attachment for rib and back muscles. Nerves will exit the vertebral column via intervertebral foramina, which are tiny holes in the vertebrae. The nerves are just going to go right on through them. The vertebral column is flexible because of intervertebral discs that sit between each vertebrae, which are made out of connective tissue, and spinal nerves also aid in flexibility. And a tip to remember the number of vertebrae and the number of vertebrae in each section of your vertebral column is to think of normal times of eating meals. So 7 a.m., 12 p.m., and 5 p.m. So 7 a.m. refers to your 7 cervical vertebrae, which are the ones that are in your neck. 12 refers to the 12 thoracic vertebrae, which are found in your thoracic cavity, obviously on the posterior side. And then 5 refers to the 5 lumbar vertebrae that you have in your lower back. And we're going to be going over characteristics of each of these different types of vertebrae because they have slightly different anatomical features. And like I said before, intervertebral discs are going to separate the vertebrae, and they function to cushion and absorb shock while providing flexibility as well. But as a person ages, the water content in these intervertebral discs decreases, and they become harder and less compressible, which leaves the person vulnerable to compression fractures or slipped discs, if you've ever heard of those. The vertebral column extends all the way from the skull down to the pelvis, and it's formed by a total of 26 irregular bones connected and reinforced by ligaments in a way that allows flexibility and characteristic curvature. So here you might be saying 7 plus 12 plus 5 is 24, but here this is 26. It's because the sacrum and the coccyx, which are 2 bones known as your tailbone, are also going to be part of this overall vertebral column. Alright, so let's look at a subtle difference between the anatomy of an adult and an infant in terms of their vertebral column. So adults and infants have 7, 12, and 5, 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar vertebrae, but their sacrum and coccyx amounts differ. So adults have 1 sacral bone and 1 coccyx for a total of 26 bones in the vertebral column, whereas infants have 5 sacral bones and 4 coccyx bones, which aids to 33 bones in their vertebral column. And the reasoning for this is because the bones eventually will fuse in the sacrum and coccyx into 1 megabone, but in infants it is not fused that way. And then a characteristic of the curvature of infant spines, babies are born with a C-shaped spine. So that's why they're able to grab their feet so easy and put them in their mouth and really be really bendy in that way. And it's because they haven't developed their cervical curve or their lumbar curve. After about 3 months old, babies have the musculature and the development associated with being able to hold their heads erect, and the cervical curve therefore develops. So instead of being C-shaped, babies pick up their head and they develop a cervical curve in their upper spine. Once the babies are able to stand, then their lower back curve is going to form, or their lumbar curve will form. And the reason that there's curvature in our spine at all is because it increases the strength of our vertebral column. It helps us maintain our balance, it absorbs shock while we are walking, and it helps protect us from fractures of our vertebral column itself. So here's what we're looking at in terms of those curvatures and what our spine actually appears like. So up here we have our 7 cervical vertebrae, and you'll see this subtle little curvature here. That's what we were talking about with babies when they hold their head up. And then we have a flexible thoracic vertebrae. It kind of goes anterior back to posterior. And then we have our wonderful lower back or lumbar curve that's going to be kind of this C shape. It kind of arches your lower back. And here's that sacrum, and then at the very bottom is the coccyx. And here you'll see a general overview of what each of these vertebrae look like. So cervical are very small, thoracic are kind of mid-range, and lumbar are very large vertebrae. So let's go into each of them. First though, there's some anatomical features that you just need to know about all of the vertebrae. And what I would like you to know is that there is a vertebral foramen. It's also sometimes referred to a foramina, but it's a big hole, and this is where the spinal cord is going to go through when all of the vertebrae are lined up. And then when you come out here, there's these items called the transverse processes, and these are going to attach to the ribs. Then there's a spinous process, which is on the posterior side of the vertebrae, and that's the one, if you were to feel along your back, you're feeling the spinous process of each of your vertebrae. And then I just want you to know the body. So this is going to be the base that is going to sandwich those intervertebral discs for support and cushion and flexibility. So here we have cervical vertebrae, and they're characterized by having 3 foramina, 1 vertebral foramina, which is where that spinal cord goes through, and then 2 little tiny transverse foramina. The first 2 vertebrae in your cervical spine are called C1, C2, and C1 is atlas and C2 is axis. And they have special names because they look different than the regular cervical vertebrae, and it's said that Atlas historically held the whole world on his shoulders, and just like that, Atlas in your cervical spine is holding your entire head, this big globe of information. So that's how it got its name. It's pretty interesting little fun fact there. And then another characteristic interesting cervical spine vertebrae is going to be C7, and this is what it looks like here. And it has a large non-bifid spinous process. So normally these cervical vertebrae have something called a bifid spinous process, meaning it jets off into 2 or bi little wedges here. But C7 does not. And C7 is actually the vertebrae, if you were to put your head down and feel the largest bump on the back of your neck, that's your C7 spinous process, and it's a point where muscles are going to attach. Here we have thoracic vertebrae, and the way I remember what thoracic vertebrae look like compared to the others is a giraffe. For some reason to me, these guys just look like giraffes, and it helps me remember if I were to ever pick up a vertebrae and see something on a side lateral view that looks like this, I'd say, okay, that is a thoracic vertebrae. And thoracic vertebrae are longer and stronger than cervical vertebrae in the cervical spine. You'll see that the spinous process is going to kind of arch down, which is different than the cervical spine. And these vertebrae articulate with the ribs. And then lastly, we have our lumbar vertebrae. These are the largest and the strongest for the weight of the body. And back muscles are going to attach to the spinous processes of these vertebrae. Spinal taps are usually done here for diagnostic purposes, and sometimes these are also called lumbar punctures. Now we're moving even more inferior to the sacrum and the coccyx. The sacrum, as you can see, is triangularly shaped, and the sacrum plus the coccyx form the foundation for the pelvic girdle. It forms the posterior portion of the pelvic cavity as well. And you can see when we are talking about infant bone amount in their vertebral column, each of these little sections would be distinct and separated, and each of these sections on the coccyx would also be separated. But as the infant ages, the bones all fuse together to form a nice cohesive unit. And the shape of this sacrum and coccyx and the way it is positioned differs in male and female bodies. So I can tell just by looking at this picture that this is going to be a female sacrum and coccyx. And the reasoning is, due to human evolution, there needs to be some room here for an infant's head to be able to push down out of the birth canal. In males, the sacrum and the coccyx is going to curve even more inward. And this is distinct from females because if we had a curvature that went into the pelvic cavity, such as we see with males, then a baby would not be able to exit out the birth canal without breaking the sacrum and the coccyx of the mother. Or it would just never be able to escape the birthing canal, in which case that would be bad for the mom and the baby. And so thankfully humans have evolved to have this distinct curvature in females to promote effective and safe childbirth. All right, now let's cover the ribs and the sternum. The thorax forms a cone-shaped cage, which is comprised of the sternum, the ribs, the T-spine, and this cartilage that connects the ribs to the sternum, which is called costal cartilage. It encloses and protects many organs such as the heart, the lungs, part of the stomach, vessels, and more. And it supports the shoulder girdle and upper extremities as well. So let's get into the anatomy of ribs. So you have 12 pairs of ribs for a total of 24 distinct individual ribs. Ribs 1 through 7, and it starts superior and goes inferior, get longer as you go down. And then ribs 8 through 12 get shorter and articulate posteriorly only with the T-spine. Ribs 1 through 7 are true ribs because they articulate both posteriorly with the spine and anteriorly with the sternum via costal cartilage. But ribs 8 through 12 don't articulate with the spine and the sternum. They only articulate with the spine, and so they're called false ribs. Ribs 8, 9, and 10 attach to each other, as you can see here, via cartilage, and then to the sternum, they are still considered false ribs. And then down here are ribs 11 and 12, and they don't articulate with anything at all, and so that is why they're called floating ribs. Lastly, here we have our wonderful sternum. It's also called the breastbone, and it is a flat bone in the median line of the thoracic cavity. It looks like a little tie that goes down your chest, and it's a common site for bone marrow biopsy. And actually, if you were to ever give CPR, the pressure that you would use and the rhythmic beat should break off this piece of bone called the xiphoid process. And that is just showing that you are compressing hard enough to initiate the pressure needed to get oxygen throughout the body, which is pretty incredible. Okay, that's all I have for you today. I hope this went well. If you have questions, let me know. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you later.